I don't need to introduce Dean Grant to you, I'm sure. He's going to be talking about the changing landscape of education, basically the ways in which education has changed recently, and maybe some ways in which it hasn't changed at all.
Yeah. Thank you, Gail.
Okay.
Before I start, could we just go around and make sure that I know all of you, and I think I know everybody, but go ahead, why don't you start, Gail?
Well, I'm Sante, school ed, ABD, and I think I know everybody here.
Yeah.
I'm Joanna, ABD. Mr. B, and already been done.
Did it and done it.
I'm first year doctoral student.
I'm sorry, your first name?
Alexandra.
Okay, great.
I'm Ruxar, and I'm also a first year doctoral student.
I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. I'm Sue Atkinson. I'm an ABD doctoral student also.
I'm Jay, and I'm also an ABD doctoral student in my fourth year, and right now I'm working on my proposal.
Great.
Rachel, and my fourth year in my ABD status.
And writing.
Lots of them.
Yes. Yes. Your reward for getting through your coursework is to write and write and write and write and write. Yes.
Which I'm doing.
Yeah.
I'm Nancy, and ABD as well, third year.
Great. Thanks.
I introduce my husband. He's our videographer for the night. And we're hopefully going to be posting this on the School of Ed website if we can successfully manage to turn it into YouTube.
If I can stay in the camera. Yeah. Well, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this issue. I thought I would start with just a little of my own background, because despite my youthful appearance, I've been doing this kind of work for a while. I graduated from the University of Maine with my degree as a teacher in 1977, back in the previous century. And during the time when the first glut of teachers hit the United States, I was a social studies teacher, and there were 200, 300 applicants for every job. The first time that really in American education that teachers were struggling to find jobs rather than coming out and going right into it. So I have great sympathy with some of our graduates who are finding it troublesome to find employment. I taught in schools in the state of Maine for about 10 years, did my master's at the University of Maine. Social studies, history, geography, all of that sort of thing. My first teacher preparation list was 6 courses. I taught 6 courses a day, and they were all different. One of the preparations I had was a quarter-length course, so every 9 weeks it would change. The first 9 weeks was the history of England. The second 9 weeks was the history of Russia. The third 9 weeks was the history of China. And then the fourth 9 weeks was the history of Africa. That was one of my preparations. So I have taught the world. There's not much that intimidates me about teaching social studies. After teaching for 10 years or so, I was invited to apply for a position at the State Education Department in Maine. Very different sort of environment, as you can imagine. Great time to go into education at the state level because it was right around the time of the Nation at Risk report in the early 1980s. And that report really put into motion lots and lots of educational ideas, some of them good, some of them not so good. We're still seeing the effects of all of that. But it was really an interesting time to be in the state education department and working with teachers and administrators across the state of Maine. As a result of that, well, actually as a result of a new commissioner coming in and she and I not seeing eye to eye on some things, she was the commissioner, I was not, so I left instead of her. I went to the University at Southern Maine for a year as the graduate director there. I thought I would try administration, decided I hated it, and then went off to Michigan State University. My wife and I sold our old farmhouse, sold our sailboat, left our dog with friends, and lived in an apartment about the size of this desk for 4 years and loved it. It was like being able to take a time out from your life at age 35. we got to read and write and think and drink cheap beer, and it was just a marvelous, marvelous experience. When I finished at Michigan State in 1994, I was hired at the University at Buffalo, one of our sister schools. I was a social studies person and spent 15 years there, going through the ranks as assistant professor, associate, and then full. And in the course of that, somehow ended up as the department chair for the largest department. Then I was an assistant dean, and then I was a few other things. And along the way, I discovered that becoming an administrator is not the absolute worst thing in the world to do. If you think about it as I always have thought about my classes, which is it's my job as the teacher to try to do everything that I can to create an environment in which the students will succeed. And I have learned about myself that I don't have particularly great patience with other adults, but I have enormous patience for children and people in my classes. So a 35-year-old who I meet on the street, maybe I'll say hello or maybe I won't, but in my class, they get my full attention. And I realized if I started to think about the faculty the same way, that it's my job to help them do the things that they want to do, it just turned my mind around in terms of the notion of being an administrator. And so after doing a few years of that, I was invited to apply for the job here as dean, and it was just like there couldn't have been a better job. In fact, it's the only dean's job I've ever applied for, because it was the only one that seemed interesting to me, because it was a place that looked like it wanted to do things, not just continue what it has done in the past. And thanks to Candace and her colleagues and the folks on this campus, it really has been that way. We don't do everything right, but we try stuff, and we're not afraid to laugh when we get it right and swear a little bit when we get it wrong, try it again, swear some more if we still don't get it right, and 3 or 4 times later then we move on. So that's my background, and I say all of that in part because I think it'll help you see some of the ways that I've framed this talk tonight. Just a couple of other things. I'm a teacher at heart, so feel free if something comes to your mind that you want to ask about along the way. I'm hoping to prod you a little bit. If something comes to mind, feel free to jump in. I also have a little exercise for you in the middle of the presentation. And then at the end, if you run out of questions about the presentation, but you want to ask, what does a dean actually do? I'd be happy to respond to things like that. I'll be making most of that up. So when Gail invited me to give the talk, I thought this was quite clever as a title. But I realized that as soon as I came up with it, I didn't really like it because the question mark was the real key to it. I'm not exactly sure, here's the spoiler alert, I'm not exactly sure whether the landscape of education really is changing or not, or whether we're just in the midst of a whole lot of atmospheric kind of talk that really hasn't changed the fundamental dynamics of teaching and learning in classrooms. So I took this as an opportunity to kind of think that through, and I hope that you'll push me a little bit as I try to push you. So, in fact, are we in a new era of schooling? As I said before, the Nation at Risk report, if you haven't read it, it's worth going into the archives and taking a look. A lot of the data that they wrote about turned out to be inaccurate, which is problematic, of course. But it really was a clarion call across the U.S. To take a look at what was going on in schools for all kids, not just for the kids who were succeeding. And we really, lots of people make the argument that we have been riding a sort of crest or a succeeding set of crests of waves of reform ever since 1983. So if things feel a little topsy-turvy now, imagine having done this since 1983 and just wishing for a calm day once in a while. In 1983 and since, this is just a short list of the things that have become matters of conjecture and for reform. The whole notion of teacher certification, in the early 80s there were large numbers of schools that had very few certified teachers. They were hiring people in temporary positions and that sort of thing. So the idea of demanding that all teachers be certified in a school was really considered quite novel at the time. There have been huge, as you all probably know, huge changes in terms of the curriculum. We've seen successive waves of reform in my discipline in social studies. States have written new curriculum. There have been new national curriculum. Local folks have developed curriculum. Most of it hasn't been very well received, and almost none of it has had any real impact. But we have also seen in the last couple of years the rise of the Common Core movement in literacy and mathematics. And while there's a lot of sort of brooding and breeding contempt for who's going to tell us what to do about literacy and mathematics, it certainly looks like it's changing some of the nature of the conversation around those two subject areas. Testing. Testing. We love testing, apparently. And despite the fact that we're not very confident that we get good results, we're going to continue testing. Damn it. School structure. Also, since 1983, the whole rise of charter schools has come into play. And in places like New Orleans and some other large cities around the U.S., there are more charter schools than there are, quote-unquote, regular public schools. And that movement slows and booms depending on a whole raft of factors in a local environment. But it certainly seems as though that movement is not going to stop. We're with it now. Time in school. I got a call or an email a couple of months ago from the Chinese radio version of the Today Show asking me if I would like to be a panelist to talk about whether New York and other schools should be going longer, those kids should be going longer during the day. I, of course, could not resist, even though I didn't know anything about it. I couldn't resist talking with panelists from around the world. I actually did some research before the talk, and it turns out sometimes yes and sometimes no, as so much of educational research is. Longer school days, longer school years, doing the same old things, not so good. Using longer hours in the day in the school year to try to do things more ambitiously turns out to be pretty good in most situations. So we're tinkering with even how long the school day and school year is. We've experimented with school uniforms, and apparently we're going to experiment with guns in schools at some point. It's hard to imagine what sort of idea somebody will not come up with as the way to turn the tide in school. David Tyack and Larry Cuban came up with this phrase, tinkering toward utopia. It's a lovely book where they analyze a number of educational reforms in terms of the premise behind the reform and then the outcomes. They're very hopeful that we are moving toward utopia. Some days I think maybe we are. Other days I think maybe we are just tinkering. So, people like to talk about a golden age of education. It's not exactly clear to me that there has ever been one. In fact, David Cohen writes about the United States as always having a very large strain of school haters. So I've pulled a few quotes. Ralph Waldo Emerson says, "We are shut up in schools and colleges and recitation rooms for 10 or 15 years and come out at last with a bag of wind, a memory of words, and do not know a thing." That's from the early 1800s. Mark Twain said, "I've never let schooling interfere with my education," in the later 1800s. George Santayana, the philosopher most famous for coming up with the quote about the relationship between, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it, says that child only educated at school is an uneducated child. And then Frank Zappa, one of my heroes, drop out of school before your mind rots from exposure to our mundane educational system. Forget about the senior prom. Go to the library. Educate yourself if you have any guts. Well, John Dewey, another of my heroes, sort of teeters between a school hater and an education lover. And in lots of ways, he makes that distinction quite clear. So on the not-so-hot side, he says a teacher is not in the school to impose certain ideas or to form certain habits in the child, but is there as a member of the community to select their influences which shall affect the child and assist him improperly of responding to these influences. So clearly the first part of that quote, he's responding to what he thinks of as the most common things happening in the schools. But again, do we love the notion of education and really saw its benefits? I believe that the school is primarily a social institution. Education being a social process, the school is simply the form of community life in which all of those agencies are concentrated that will be most effective in bringing the child to share in the inherited resources of the race and to use his own powers for social ends. I believe that education, therefore, is a process of living and not a preparation for future living. You can't say things like that if you don't have real faith in the notion of education. You may not like the institution of schools, but the notion that we are only in large part, only what we have been taught in both formal and informal ways is really a pretty powerful idea. So if you look at the history of American education, you can, in some ways, you can sort of see it as a kind of contrast, a tension between faith in schools as a social mediator and a transformative process, moving toward democracy, real democracy, but you can also see a strain in the educational history where people just dismiss schooling as ever really going to make much of a difference. Part of that, we think, is, or historians seem to think, is that there really has been no golden age, no time when it was all good for all people. And Dewey really makes the argument that a lot of that is because we tend to think in these dichotomies. It's either one thing or the other. In terms of the purpose of schooling, is it to transmit the past into the hard drives in kids' heads and make them continue the status quo? Or is it really about transforming their lives and giving them the tools and skills and knowledge that they're going to be able to make themselves better? Is the focus on the individual student, or is it on the group? Is the approach that we use a rote learning approach, or is it about inquiry? We've been debating these things for an awful long time. We seem not to have settled in one direction or another, but it, in some ways, just having the fact that it is or and, I think is part of the issue that we're dealing with. Largely because I think dichotomous thinking tends to be unproductive when you're talking about something that's complex. Dichotomous thinking, this or that, is pretty good if you only have a simple situation and you only have two choices. And one choice is good and the other one's bad. Other than that, dichotomous thinking doesn't really get us very far because the fact that the world is complicated and nuance rules. So the devil lies in the details, the changing landscape of education, yeah, but it's the question mark that really is the key here. So I would like to sort of talk through three examples and then pose a fourth example to you to sort of see what sort of sense we can make of it. I picked three easy ones, no controversy here: testing, charter schools, and standards. So in terms of testing, I focused on the No Child Left Behind law, the premise of which, or at least one of the premises, is that high-stakes testing is a leverage point for fundamental reform. George Bush and his folks down in Texas who pushed the early version of No Child Left Behind really keyed on this notion that if it is tested, it is taught, and if it's tested well, it will be taught well, and therefore you have cracked the problem that is the American education system. Well, so I started thinking, is that notion landscape transforming? And on the positive, or the yes side, I thought there are at least some things there that could be argued are transforming. First of all, No Child Left Behind is one of the first not first, but one of the most inclusive national scope kinds of projects to promote testing as a vehicle for change. Certainly elevated the stakes, particularly for kids, and now, as we'll see, for teachers. And it has had an influence on teaching. It's not exactly clear that it has had only a negative effect on teaching. In fact, a lot of the research that I do, or did before I became white Caird and Dean Lee, was on how are teachers responding to new state-level tests in terms of history and social studies. And the research that the findings that we built largely said testing poorly influences teachers who are not probably very thoughtful teachers anyway, and they use it as a justification for why they have to drill and skill kids day after day after day. Teachers who are more ambitious, who have more of a sense of self-efficacy, testing is just the thing that they need to do in order to show the good things that they're already doing. The best example I can give you of that is one teacher, an 8th grade teacher in a city school in western New York, whose class was composed in thirds of identified gifted, identified special ed, and identified whatever we call kids in the middle these days. So talk about a diverse population. She taught her class to the kids at the highest level in her mind. In other words, she really focused on ideas and the notion that every single kid in this class can grasp those ideas. Every one of her kids passed what was the 8th grade version of the Regents, and the kids laughed when they took the test, called her over and would say things like, "This is really easy, Miss so-and-so." And she got equal numbers of kids who were labeled as gifted and kids labeled as special ed, making those kinds of comments. So teachers can do absolutely amazing things if they put their mind to it. And testing can get in the way only to the effect that teachers sort of let it get in the way. So landscape changing, some possibilities, but maybe not. We have in the U.S. and particularly in New York a very long history of state level and relatively high stakes testing. There are and continue to be big doubts about whether tests are valid measures. One of the phrases that I like to use is, do people believe that as a result of their kids passing these state level exams that they actually know anything? And I think you'd have to say that lots of the public are still not convinced. My daughter does great on math, higher level math exams, and yet she still can't make change. I somehow think there's a relationship. She ought to be able to make change. I don't even ask her to find the tip on a restaurant bill. But it makes me realize that there's a public face validity to testing that we have not conquered. The public is still a little skeptical about whether the tests that we've created actually measure anything worth value. At least so far, No Child Left Behind is only testing kids in a limited number of grades, and there have been estimates that as many as 60%, 70% in some people's minds of New York teachers will be evaluated, but they won't be evaluated because there's no state test in their grade level. So that confuses things in lots of ways. And sadly, but frankly, we have a long tradition in this country of blaming kids and their families if they don't do very well in schools. And so you hear it when teachers and schools don't perform very well. Well, you know the population that we work with. Well, that teacher that I described to you knew what the population was too, and she managed to work around it. So, my conclusion at this point is that there's really little change, a landscape transforming change that we can attribute to No Child Left Behind, at least in terms of the testing. So I thought this was quite a clever statement. We've seen some change in some scores in some states, but nothing consistently positive. So like too many things in education, we see some movement, but it never really sustains. And as a result, we end up feeling kind of inconclusive about where it's going. And the second thing that I think is probably maybe even as important is No Child Left Behind and many of these reforms have been sold to us and to the public as a way to increase faith. Remember, we were talking about faith and doubt. Increase faith in schools. And it's not exactly clear that that has happened. In fact, there are lots of folks, surveys that suggest that faith in school, faith in the idea that kids are getting a proper education, really has not gone very, very well. So that's the first example of landscape changing with a question mark. Any comments, thoughts about that? This would be where you would talk.
Do you feel that the accelerated amount of testing that seems to accompany the implementation of the new APPR changes anything that you've said?
Don't be stealing my thunder there. We're going to talk about APPR in a little bit. Yeah, that's going to be that's worth thinking about. That's worth thinking about. Yeah. Any other thoughts at this point? Shall we try another example? Okay. So charter schools also seem like a potentially landscape changing idea. The premise here, it's not testing that's going to change things, it's the way schools are structured, and that if we can change the structure of schooling, that will really initiate a sort of big school change. The landscape changing notions look like these. The fact that they can hire non-unionized teachers. You know, teacher unions are a big bugaboo. Lots of people want to put the ills of teaching and learning at the feet of unions, when in fact, if you really look at worldwide, some of the nations that have some of the strongest student test scores are highly unionized, and others that are not very good schools. Charter schools have fewer regulations than traditional public schools, and again, another idea that if we give them more opportunity to be creative and open, that things will get better. They do have much longer school days and school years, and also a fair degree of autonomy in terms of not only having more or fewer regulations, but they have, particularly the administrators, have more autonomy to make decisions. So in lots of ways, this is kind of an interesting example because it combines a number of different activities all under the same umbrella term. Is it, in fact, landscape changing? Well, there are at least a few ideas that would suggest that it's not. We have seen some pretty severe, frankly, fiscal mismanagement of charter schools. Most states have taken a pretty strong stance and have shut them down fairly quickly, but you go through a year or two process where a charter school is being de-chartered because of fiscal mismanagement that can have a pretty big effect on kids and teachers. The research reports on charter schools really yield a pretty inconsistent pattern. There are reports that will come out, it seems every 6 months, that yes, we finally know charter schools are the answer, followed 2 weeks later by a report that says, well, maybe not, or maybe just for some kids and not all kids. And that's really to this last point. A number of charter schools have produced pretty dramatic increases in scores, but they have limited the participation, particularly of special ed kids, kids on free and reduced lunch. So skimming kids from the sort of top of the academic list and then trumpeting that your school is doing great by them when in fact they probably could have done just as well by, as Frank Zappa says, going to the library, really makes you wonder what the sort of final notion of the research is going to suggest. So in thinking about both the positives and the negatives, it again seems to me that there's probably little change that we can attribute to charter schools themselves in terms of transforming the landscape of schooling. They certainly have had enough success to become now a clear alternative to public schools. As I said earlier, they are not going to go away. Both because they've had some success, there's certainly a political and social movement behind the notion of charter schools, and there are enough doubts about whether the public schools can do all that we want them to do to ensure that that institution is going to continue with us. However, it hasn't really fostered huge change in the public school system, and frankly, there were people when the charter school movement started who thought realistically this will cause public schools to be eliminated. Well, that's certainly not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Thoughts about charter schools? Yeah?
You mentioned that it's a kind of a shift towards this non-unionized pure regulations, and I wonder if it's simply a reversion back to before teachers were unionized, before there was as many regulations in education as there is now. Thinking back to that time of pure regulations and as non-unionized, do you feel that this is significantly different than simply education a long, long time ago?
So are you asking if this is just a longing for a simpler time?
Is it just another example of in education how the pendulum swings, if you will, just back to a previous state instead of really something truly different?
Yeah. Well, you know, if you ask most people in a survey, do you like regulation or you don't like regulation, they'll say no. But of course, if you ask them a list of regulations, they're going to pick out the ones that favor them, and they're going to be all in favor of those. So we like regulations that help us. We don't like regulations that seem to get in our way. You have to remember that most of the regulations around schooling came about because we weren't doing such a hot job with all of the kids. You know, the reason that we have lots of the mandates that we have is because we simply have ignored big populations of kids for generations. It's hard to imagine that's worth going back to, you know? Have regulators sometimes gone crazy in terms of trying to anticipate everything that a nutty teacher or administrator would do and prevent that? I think so. But it's hard. It's really hard for me to fault people who wanted to make sure that more kids, all kids, had equal opportunities to things, you know, and that teachers ought not to be fired for no reason, and that kids ought to be able to get a lunch if they can't get one at home, and on and on and on, you know. What do you think?
It seems to me that it's kind of just going back to before those regulations were put into place. I think for reasons that you mentioned, maybe not a great idea.
Maybe if we could take the sensibilities we have now and good-heartedness and transport ourselves back, maybe not. Somebody else? Yeah.
I was wondering, it seems like charter schools, sometimes when you look at how they're put together, it's like the same old thing as public school, except it's like a for-profit model.
Yeah.
And it's not really any different. So when you're saying structural change, to me, real structural change would be something like a community school that reconstructs how the school is relating to the whole community. It's rethinking what school is. And charter schools are just doing the same old, same old. In fact, it seems like so many of them are going backwards. It's like, oh, you know, they're going back to uniforms, they're going back to we have strict rules and strict expectations, and the kids do recitations. It's almost like turning the clock back instead of structurally changing education, which maybe would be transformative.
That's an interesting point, because charter schools were proclaimed as system changing, when in fact I think you're absolutely right. There are ways that we could change the structure of school that charter schools can't even approach, or haven't approached for the most part. Anybody else?
Are the kids in charter schools tested the same way as in public schools?
Yeah.
So they do not enjoy any autonomy in testing?
Not really. It's pretty interesting to me that before No Child Left Behind, many school districts in New York State particularly got waivers from the Regents exams and that sort of thing because they were able to show that their kids consistently did well. They came up with their own alternative assessments, some of them much more authentic and that sort of thing. And then that whole waiver system got completely eliminated with No Child Left Behind. There's now talk at the national level of allowing waivers from some of the testing, but it certainly seems as though we've gone from a more sane way of deciding whether to test or not to a lockstep method of deciding that everybody needs to be tested. And it's anybody's guess, I think, as to where this all
in homeschooling aren't held to the
Right.
held
Right.
to the same regulations. They don't
Right.
have the same testing regulations.
Right. Right. But charter schools, for the most part, are publicly funded, and so therefore, some of the regulations that they have to do are things like state level testing and that kind of thing. Yeah. Anything else? All right, let's see a third example. Standards, and more specifically the Common Core. Here the premise is that it's not structure, it's not testing, it's not uniforms, it's not this or that. The real way to change education is through the curriculum, the ideas that are talked about in the classroom. And there are, I would argue, some landscape changing notions there. The Common Core, I think, has some flaws, but it is far more rich and ambitious than what passes for most of the curriculum in the state levels across the United States. Pretty awful stuff, frankly. A lot of time, a lot of earnest energy, but pretty awful stuff has come out of most state curriculum writing exercises. There's also the notion that the Common Core in literacy and math would be tied to new and by declaration, if not reality, new exams that are supposed to be more ambitious and more authentic. We'll see. And the Common Core is not a national project, but it's darn close when you think that 46 states have signed on to this effort. There has always been huge resistance in this country toward a nationalized curriculum. And the people who want to beat up on the Common Core effort will call it a national curriculum. They, meaning Washington, are trying to tell us what to do, when in fact it really was an effort that was at least sparked by the states and the National Governors Association. So it does not have Washington roots, but because it is so large, and because the Obama administration has tied things like Race to the Top money to the adoption of the Common Core, it's now got that patina of Washingtonness. And every week, if you read Education Week, there's one more state commissioner who's saying, well, I'm not so sure this Common Core thing is right for our state. So it's really, I think it's going to be anyone's guess as to whether this has any legs in terms of getting down to teachers. So there's a big no list about it being landscape changing. Here in New York, we've been creating state level curriculum through syllabi for 100 years or so. And just as long, the idea that what schools are doing is mind-numbing to children, and that we ought to be doing something more intellectual and more ambitious. And that goes back into the early 1800s. New York has long tied testing to course syllabi, so we've been doing that sort of thing. And the possibility that it really is not, the Common Core really is not national, and there is no national hammer that the Secretary of Education has to enforce fidelity to the Common Core. So, as I said, I think the jury's out. We will be living through the idea of whether the Common Core is landscape transforming or not. I think it will be if it really changes teachers' views of what kids are able to do, changes their views of their content, and changes their views of themselves. If they see the Common Core as the impetus to do something more ambitious, and that they and their kids are capable of doing that, then I think it really could be an incredible change. But if it doesn't do those things, if it becomes routinized, if we just get a lot of Common Core worksheet day one, Common Core, somebody's creating those things right now as we speak. And if it can't be validly and reliably assessed, if the public still thinks that my kid's gone through the Common Core and they still can't make change, it doesn't pass the sniff test. It's not it's not going to have the kind of impact, I think, that these big reform movements really are after. Yeah.
Sorry, I've been sitting up. No, I think just after talking with lots of veteran teachers and new teachers about this and the policy changes that go along with the Common Core, right? I don't know. A lot of the veteran teachers have said, like, if you're a good teacher, these are things we're doing. If you are a new teacher and you don't know, it's nice because it's do this, and here's the outline for doing it. And if people could use it for a touchstone, as, here's what's out there, here's what's suggested, and that every class you have is filled with individuals. And the way your class rolls is going to be different day to day, period to period, whatever. That if there weren't the tests and the APPR and all of that stress tied to it, it could be a really lovely thing. But that for some teachers who maybe come into the profession without a lot of skill or background, that for them, it might be the be-all, end-all. You know what I mean? Yep. And that's where it becomes, okay, how do we do it more efficiently? Because it's huge.
Yeah.
And scary and cumbersome in, a lot of ways. And it's particularly, I would think, for a novice teacher.
Yeah. I've often had the thought that most of these policies were designed to affect the teachers who are not doing well by their children. They're not designed to enhance and support the work of great teachers. And so, for most really good teachers, they see these things coming through, and they think either this has nothing to do with me, or I'm getting lumped in the same category as people who are just putting their time in. So we have not been very good in this country at helping support the teachers who are really trying, and more importantly, those teachers who really want to do something more but aren't quite sure what to do. I think that the Common Core could do something like that. Now, one of the things that's very interesting to me is they spend millions and millions of dollars developing the Common Core, but there are pennies devoted to implementing the Common Core. Well, sometimes history matters. We went through a similar exercise in the 1960s after Sputnik, where the National Science Foundation put millions of dollars into the development of new school curriculum, not a penny of it into professional development, and it was lovely stuff, and it's still on the shelves. Some of the book spines haven't even been cracked. I would hate to think that we are repeating that, but it sure seems that the money that has been put into this effort has gone on the design side, and the expectation seems to be it's so brilliant, it'll just pop into their heads, and they will know what to do with it. We don't have a lot of experience with that working out.
I'm afraid that it might be worse. I've seen the curriculum the National Science Foundation made, their actual books, and you could go to it and there's your lesson. And yes, the professional development to transition to that curriculum would have been important, but we don't have such books now for Common Core. It's not a Common Core curriculum, it's a Common Core standards.
Right.
We don't have any curriculum, and I'm looking the TLQP grant where the teachers are coming in, they're freaking out because they do not have something they can go to the shelf and say, this is my lesson on fractions that will satisfy the Common Core standards. I don't even think we are doing as good a job as they did then.
Well, that's a fair point. That's a fair point, because one of the outcomes of the 1960s NSF stuff was the actual creation of curriculum materials. I think everybody thinks that publishers are gearing up for all of that stuff, but there will be a lag for sure. And in effect, we're relying on commercial publishers to get it right too, and they don't have a great record, frankly, of pushing more ambitious kinds of teaching and learning. So there are lots of ways for it to really fold in on itself. But we're still too fresh for it really to even kind of know, I think. Any other points about the Common Core?
Weren't the New York State standards optional? I mean, wasn't that what was nice about, I mean, they might not have been, you know, rich or whatever, but weren't they just like originally proposed as guidelines for teachers? Like, here's a kind of an outline of what you might like to strive for or whatever, or kind of an outline for what biology looks like or something like that. I thought that those were originally introduced as kind of optional things, where this is
Not really optional.
Not- well, but flexible maybe I'm looking for. Like you didn't have to. I mean, certainly was an APPR, and there wasn't this. I mean, I remember teaching 20 years ago with, you know, doing the state tests and preparing our kids. We didn't have to do what I see teachers doing.
Well, I think what happened is when New York went through its standards writing, because New York had always written syllabi, which were very specific course descriptions of the ideas that you had to teach. No bones about it. But we went through a standards writing phase in the early to mid 1900s, or not 1990s. And so these much more global standards were written. In social studies, the first standard was students will know U.S. history. There you go. Work with that. And there was such an outcry that those standards were meaningless that the state went back and essentially wrote syllabi again. And so the first standard in New York for U.S. history is students will know U.S. history. But then in 11th grade, U.S. history is 33 single-spaced pages of what that means. So is that telling teachers what to do? Yeah. And one line of that might be, the Civil War had many causes. Well, there's a week's lessons from that one line.
Yeah, but I seem to, just with the history bit, right, they had, it was, you know, you had to teach whatever grade level you were teaching, you had to teach it through like 5 windows, right, historical, economic, cultural, social, and something else, which I think I remember. And then they'd say like, oh, you know, 5th grade is North America. You know, 6th grade was history of the world from, you know, beginning of time to modern day. You know, that kind of thing. And then you'd have to say, okay, what will I do? And then teachers, unfortunately, teachers who were not invested in learning about cultures that they had no idea about had the option of blowing that off. So if they, you know, had to teach the history of the world and you knew that you couldn't and do it developmentally either for a 12-year-old, who could, you know, and that you would pick the things that you were most familiar with, or you would pick the things that were in the news, kind of thing. So it was every kid got a different education, essentially.
Yeah. Well, you know, as directive as a 33-page single-spaced document for one grade level seems, of course, that leaves enormous room for teachers to make individual decisions because you can't possibly even do that.
You can't.
So you're making curricular choices, whether you think you are or not. And the standards, as I said, were quite global. The actual curricula, syllabi varied dramatically. The kindergarten one was about a page and a half and just said family about 50 times. So they really varied in quality, which of course gives you even more license to do what you want to do. Anything else on standards? All right. So get your pens out. Let's see what you think. So we've got this new teacher evaluation, not new process, the APPR, Annual Performance PR thing, professional performance something R. That's not new. What's new is the tie to state level testing, the use of locally designed or purchased exams, and the computing of scores on a 1 to 4 level. Teachers are either highly effective, developing, or really not very good, I guess. I forget what the fourth one is. And as a result of that, they will have, if they are in one of those two the bottom two categories, they have essentially 2 years to become effective. Or they don't get dismissed automatically, but districts can start initiating a streamlined version of dismissal based on 2 years of data. A number of other states are doing this with more or less effect, but it's quite clear that this is on teachers' minds. So take a couple of minutes, think about what are the landscape changing elements of that notion, what things might not be so important or powerful, and then see where you come out in the end. Shoot.
Yeah. They all dropped out. Right
CV ready.
What goes on Vita and what doesn't go on Vita. How to find a job.
They scare you.
In higher ed.
In higher ed.
This would be scaring me, though, if I were, a new teacher. That's the first thing.
Interesting.
I disagree.
You disagree?
Yeah, I think it's scarier to practicing teachers than new teachers. The new teachers, they don't know any better.
Oh, to practicing teachers, yeah.
Yeah.
I
The new
agree.
teachers, they're coming in.
Right, I
so
know, they don't, yeah.
Yeah.
Nice point.
My students are like, this is what I have to do, okay.
Yeah.
They don't know any different.
Right, exactly. And that, for me, is a problem.
Another kind of problem. So what did you come up with? Were there some landscape changing ideas that you saw?
I put fear of professional decision making and job loss, which is pretty. I used to love to tell people to become teachers and how great it would be, and I think for people my age who are veteran teachers, all of a sudden they've trusted their professionalism, their knowledge, the parts of teaching that are intuitive and hard to measure. So that for them is definitely changing the game. And the APPR might have precise measurements, but I don't think they're effective for somebody who knows options, other ways of teaching and measuring and assessing. Like you said, Katie, like new teachers wouldn't, but for anybody who is there because they love it.
So it could be landscape changing in terms of the profession and the sort of aims of the profession that teachers hold in their heads.
Oh yeah, and the morale of the profession, I think is.
Okay. Someone else? Yeah, landscape changing, yeah.
I'm thinking of your example of the teacher with the one-third gifted and the one-third special ed, and, you know, sort of teaching around all the restrictive things that other people are complaining about. And I think there's a chance that this might be the tipping point where it gets impossible to do that, where, you know, the good teachers can no longer kind of not let the testing take over. That way of looking at things that we always hope and they're trained teachers to do is not necessarily going to work for them anymore. And when you combine that with layoffs and shortages and fear and everything else, and the fact that, you know, any of us who can are leaving the classroom, you know, who's left, you know, and I think it has the potential to be landscape changing.
Landscape changing need not be in a positive direction, apparently. Anybody else? Landscape changing? Yeah.
I said very close to, as Nancy was saying, because of the fear of losing their job and wanting to retain their job, that teachers would alter their strategies in the classroom. So instead of following more of a textbook-based or lecture-based approach, they might focus on student-centered and integrate the curriculum, maybe integrate music and science in an experiment to bring using sounds, auditory, kinesthetic, and appealing to their students' learning strategies to reach out to them and foster understanding and to allow them to succeed on their tests. So they might be more experimental than in moving away from strategies.
One could hope. One could hope that would happen. Any other? Yeah.
One of the things this was reminding me of is years ago when I was working with Kathy Kieran, we were looking at teacher effectiveness, and she had me doing all these searches of the literature, and we started to come down to this hot and cold cognition, and they were talking about people who do things like Nancy was saying intuitively, that kind of hot cognition in the moment, and they're responding to the students in the moment, and that's almost like a mind frame that people can have. And now this APPR is kind of saying, well, no, you really need to have a cold cognition where you can be reflective and stand back from what you're doing. And I'm wondering, I don't know, but I'm wondering how that would affect people who perform better in that kind of hot cognition, kind of intuitive form, which sounds like they're the most effective teachers usually, but maybe it will round them. I was just with Dr. Washburn last week, and the principal was talking about we're having these wonderful conversations, and this is from his point of view. He's having these wonderful conversations with the teachers over APPR, and I thought, well, you know, maybe if they really are quality conversations, you know, maybe it does kind of combine that ideal of, you know, the hot and cold cognition. But I wonder, and my real big question has to do with the assessment piece and how valid that piece is.
Right.
And Erin and I were talking about that too. Like, how good are these local tests? And if they're not good, I mean, that could just destroy those wonderful intuitive teachers that Nancy was talking about.
Yeah. Other ideas about? Yeah.
I don't know if it'll be lasting, but I know from working with TLQP that I've been working with them for 5 years, and this year I'm seeing more of a desire from the teachers for that professional development than I've ever seen before. And I mean, we're basically providing the same kind of professional development as always. The shift in coming for it in the math realm is what Dr. Schmidt has been advocating for years, decades, you know. So she's not changing the technique she's showing these teachers, but all of a sudden they're interested on a level they've never been before. So we've shown them how to meaningfully divide fractions. I don't know how many times, but this year they came in and said, we need to know how to meaningfully divide fractions. And I'm like, did you not hear the last 16 times she told you, you know? But there's this desire in them. It's not imposed by us, or they're not there just because they're getting paid for professional development. But they really are seeing, I don't know how to teach math in this conceptual way that the Common Core is demanding. And so all of a sudden it's gotten their attention. Like I said, I don't know how long lasting that will be. I'm assuming once they see how the tests are going to go, the anxiety level will come down a little bit and some of that will come down. But I do think that that's one area that we have kind of an open door right now as teacher educators that there is
Huh.
a desire from in-service teachers for this professional
Yeah.
development.
It's hard to imagine if teachers say to themselves in an honest moment, you know, I really don't know how to teach all the kids in my class.
Yeah.
I wonder if I can learn how to do that. Wow, that could be astounding.
It
That could be astounding.
I think that's one really positive area that I've seen.
Yeah. How about on the no, not landscape transforming at all side? Seriously? Nothing? You think that it really will be landscape
I guess
transforming?
I don't agree with the stress element. I mean, I think it's probably as much stress I've ever seen in my short experience in education. But it's, I mean, when No Child Left Behind came in, people were really stressed there, and funding was tied to the standards then.
Yeah.
I mean, now teachers' jobs are tied to it, so it's more extreme, but it seems like that's the nature of education. There's
Mhm.
always a new wave, there's always a
Yeah, yeah.
reaction to it. So I think in some way, I think it's worse, but I think in some way it's kind of just the nature of the beast.
Hmm. Interesting. Anybody else? Yeah, Jude.
Well, I was thinking, for this one, I try to define what a good teacher is.
Yeah.
I think the good thing is we might produce some new ideas. Okay, this is something we have new technology, we have new things, so we have new standards for this good teachers. The no side might be we're producing, if everyone got those professional development training, this would be good teacher would be. So every teacher would be like, okay, this is a good teacher. The good teacher would teach a class with 3 sentences of introduction and
Yeah.
you know those kind
Right.
of
Right.
things that might be really
Right.
bad for the
Yeah. And Rachel makes a nice point about the power of professional development, but the fact of the matter is most professional development is just awful. Just awful.
Well, it's different for them. I mean, what teachers are getting in the last couple of years, I know because it's part of my job for the last
Mhm.
3 years, you know, they're more putting band-aids on issues that may be social issues that are that they're seeing more of
Mhm.
or they're paying more attention to. So if you ask teachers and administrators who've been there for a while, like what'd you learn in the 90s when you got professional development? They say, oh, you know, the whole child, and we learned about
Mhm.
multiple intelligences, and we learned
Right.
about different ways of teaching and assessing. And now you ask them, and they say, oh, our meetings are on APPR, the new tests, and my job is on stress and conflict. I go teach teachers how to deal with stress and conflict, do it for kids, administrators,
Mhm.
teachers, paraprofessionals. We do truancy and engagement because truancy is up, especially particularly with boys now. They're disconnecting a lot sooner than the girls. And bullying. So the nature of professional development has changed in this area, at least, pretty
Interesting.
drastically in the last 20 years.
So here's a question for you as we think about the teacher evaluation system. What percentage would you guess State Education Department has estimated will be the number of teachers who fall in those bottom 2 categories?
The state, did you
Mhm.
say?
Mhm. What do you think? 40? Too high, G?
No, I'm
Too low?
thinking no,
Low.
yeah, maybe
Lower?
10,
10?
maybe less than that.
You think 2, Sue?
I'm not sure. But I also know there are people who purport that their results have to be a bell curve, so.
Yeah, well, we'll see about that. That's a very
No,
interesting
there are
point.
administrators who
Yeah.
say they're required to
Yeah.
have them come out
Yeah.
of the bell curve.
Yeah.
No, I'm not making this up.
Well, the unofficial numbers that I've seen from state ed people is 10%. There have been at least 3, maybe 4 states that have published their first set of results based on their statewide evaluations. Take a wild guess what the number was.
High.
2.5
Oh, 2.5.
in Florida,
Wow.
3% in Michigan.
Why do you think that is? I mean, do you think they're being accurate? I mean, whatever. I mean, I remember people playing with, not me, but people playing with test scores because it reflected on the school. So give them what they want, they get off your back.
Well, but think about it now. We've invested years, millions of dollars, enormous amounts of time and energy to identify in Florida 2.5% of the teachers as having a problem. I guarantee you that if you walked into a school in Florida and said to a third grader, tell me who the good teachers are and who the bad teachers are, they would name that 2.5% of the teachers in that school. A third grader would tell you. So what are we doing? I mean, the first response is, that should be great news. The fact of the matter is, the vast bulk, as we know, the vast bulk of teachers are good teachers. But you know how this is going to get spun. Well, the tests aren't rigorous enough. They're not sensitive. You know, if you have the agenda that teachers are the problem, you're going to find ways to continue to say teachers are the problem. All right, so let me wrap this up with a few conclusions. You know, sometimes I wonder really if there is anything new in the field of education. I thought Rachel's example was lovely. Jean Schmidtau has been talking since I was a boy about how to teach fractions in exactly the same way, and now it's hot. You know, John Dewey. There's no researcher in America who ought to be citing anybody but John Dewey because he's already thought of everything. And yet we call things different things and we think we've discovered something new. So what's the point? Is real change a pipe dream? Well, can anything really be new? We need to understand that flashy is not the same thing as good. The difficulty of turning around an aircraft carrier. It takes a mile at sea to turn an aircraft carrier around. They're not very nimble. Well, most big social institutions, healthcare, law, the economy, those are not very nimble kinds of institutions either. And schools seem like they should be, but in fact it turns out that they are very complex, complicated, and not easily, there's no real panacea. But there's always the possibility that there may be some ideas that we can put in combination that could have some sort of a real and positive effect on kids. So I've been thinking about this last line a lot. There are more actors, there's more activity, and more interest in education than any other time, it's certainly in my 50-some years. This may be the last best chance to do something good before our attention turns someplace else. But we may blow it too. You know, there are a lot of ideas in the air, but to build a consensus around those ideas is proving pretty difficult. You know, it's kind of the idea of the weak thing, and that has never served us well in education, and it's unlikely to in the future. Maybe we just need to sort of, I'll say this because it's late in the afternoon, maybe we need to vomit out all these ideas before we can figure out which are the ones that are really worth working on. But this has been a kind of a long upchuck, frankly, since 1983 of ideas, and we're not seeing the sort of crystallization points that we're seeing crystallization points around charter schools, testing, and standards, but we're not seeing them crystallize in ways that are really, I think, pushing where kids could go if we really gave them an opportunity. So that's what I've got.
Thank you.
Thank you.